Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. We're going to kick off with a showing you guys how to get into our Knowledge Center, where we have all of our data sets listed and explanations from what they are, what they're representing, to how often they're updated. And these are being updated on a regular basis as we add our new data sets. So as you go in the top right corner under your login name, you can access this through the Knowledge Center. You can, if you do not have a SONAR login or haven't participated in the free trial, you can also access all of this information at sonar.freightwaves.com.
FreightWaves.com /sonar.
Sonar. Sorry about that. And as you can see, we have everything from our weekly market updates to all of these webinars we do are also posted at the bottom under our exclusive insights. That is all these buttons here are showing our data sets, the explanations as we mentioned, and how often they're being updated and who within your organization will probably be most interested in using them or looking at them. And then our SONAR index definitions is a very important one. We've added just in July alone roughly 60 new indices, and they're all listed here along with the acronym. So it will help you find them on the SONAR platform. And I believe there's also the airport codes for the X market. The geographical locations, are also listed here. And again, this can all be found via the website, freightwaves.com /sonar if you do not have a SONAR login to our dashboard here at the platform. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Zach, and I believe we're going to get started with our weekly update here through SONAR.
Thank you, Brad. So I just want to be clear up front that this is not meant to be a 101 type webinar this week, where we are going to have some 101 type moments where I show you how to build certain things in the SONAR platform, but we have a broad audience to talk to now. There's more advanced stuff that's in here. Like Brad said, we have a lot of stuff available on the website now, so you can educate yourself, or if you're stuck in some sort of spot, you're not sure where to get the indices or what's in there, what they mean. I'm obviously going to explain through the ones that I show you today, but I don't want to spend a lot of time in the 101 sessions. All of the webinars from that series are posted on the website in the place that we just went. So you can go back through those if you need more of a basic overview of SONAR and what it can do. As we've gone through the last month and a half, we're now in more of a middle ground. I'm going to mix in a little bit of advanced usership along with some 101 stuff as it pertains to the current market itself. So we did add a few indices this week. Automotive Production is one of them. I can type. So what we've done is we've added automotive production for each market, as they're represented in the KMA level, like most of our markets are. So one thing to note is if there is no automotive production in a KMA, that will return nothing. So in Detroit, for instance, probably the largest automotive production in the country, you see here the number of units that were produced in the Detroit market in, looks like, April. So this is going to be updated on a monthly basis. It's a good indicator for those of you that are involved in any kind of manufacturing cycle pertaining to cars. This is all light vehicles. There's no heavy vehicles in here. So it's your Toyotas and Volkswagens and cars like that, all light, no Class A OEMs. But again, if you have anything to do with the automotive industry on a carrier level or even in the supply chain itself, this is very good information for y'all to have. Again, it's auto is the ticker, and it will be available at a KMA level granularity. The next one that we've added are the housing starts. So I'm just going to give you an example. So say I don't know the ticker symbol here. So I just typed in housing and it pulled up single family and multifamily housing starts as the top level. So a good search tip to do there, like if you don't know what particular item that you're looking for, type in the keywords, which again are listed on the website. There's underneath where Brad showed you those buttons. If you click on any of those buttons, there's a common language search feature that's underneath some of those tickers. I'll go ahead and just show you real fast. And it'll tell you right here, type tender lead in the search box for a list of available markets. And that's a quick way to kind of search what's available in each one of those ticker indices. So housing starts, they are actually a very relevant economic indicator for the trucking market itself. I think most people understand that have been in freight for a little while, but for those of you that haven't, basically what this is telling you is how many houses have been started for construction in the last month. And it's a Census Bureau indice. And what they do, and they seasonally adjust this because housing starts are very seasonal. In the winter, it tends to crash quite a bit. And in the summer, it picks back up as the warmer season begins, or actually the early spring into the summer. So when people are buying houses, people are building houses. So as housing demand increases, that tends to lead to the general economy being good, but also construction and raw materials move as houses get constructed. So the more of that's getting pumped into the freight market and the economy, that's generally the more activity you're going to see. It's going to impact your spot market activity all the way up to the general level. Like it's going to suck capacity. I think we've all heard that capacity is tight in general. And so anytime that you have a surge of activity in any sector whatsoever, it impacts the entire freight market. So as it pertains to housing starts, you're going to think about lumber and anything that you can think of that goes into a house when these are getting pumped up. Now, the last month was not a great month for housing starts. They dropped off about 12.3% overall. What that tends to indicate, it's not necessarily a bad sign. It's just something to note. As you can see, it tends to fall in the summer in general. As we enter into the later part of the summer, as people kind of wind down their construction activity, they don't start a lot of houses as they go into the slow sales season because they're not going to get done in time to sell the units. So they don't want to have this inventory sitting out there and not being sold. So a little retraction is not that unusual. It did happen a little bit earlier than we expected this year, but it's still not a huge indicator of any kind of economic slowdown. Take it for what it's worth, but it is something worth noting. Again, single family and multifamily housing starts are what they're labeled under.
And can you go over what exactly does 83.8 mean? Is that
okay? Yes, that's a good question. These are in thousands. So last month, 83,800 houses were started in the month of June.
Okay.
So, and again, down here, single family or multifamilies, 26,000 houses. Those are your apartments and whatnot. So those two numbers combined are the housing starts for the month.
Okay.
Cool.
Thanks.
Right on. So from that, I'm going to transition into our kind of weekly market update. For those of you that are just signing in for the first time, we generally go through kind of a process. It'll hopefully help a lot of you kind of understand how to use SONAR and what it means in terms of, it covers the gamut from broad-ranged economic analysis to day-to-day operational activity. And we think that you need both of those to really get the best picture of what's happening in the freight market. So you've heard me talk about the Cass Freight Index in the past. It's one of my favorite measures of shipment activity. I live this working at a carrier, so I know that it's pretty valid. For those of you that are unfamiliar, I'll give you a quick description. Again, if you want more detailed stuff, check out our website. Basically, what it is an index based on invoices Cass has, and they're the largest provider of invoicing in the freight industry. So what you're looking at here is their shipment index, and when you have more shipment volume, this index goes up. It's indexed based on 2012 information at this point. So what it means right now is that June of 2018 is 25% higher than it was in 2012 in the base year. So anytime that you get, you see these large shipment spikes, that means volume is being pumped into the freight markets. Now, that's not the total picture of understanding capacity in the freight market. As most of us know, volume does have a significant impact. And you can see here that in the last, we're seeing shipment volumes at levels that we have not seen in the last 10 years. That's pre-Great Recession time, or back in 2009, for those of you that don't know what that is. The market died significantly. There was a lot of job market activity that day. I mean, a lot of people got laid off. There wasn't a lot of volume going out. Inventories increased. Freight markets really fell off in 2009. So right now we're seeing levels higher than that of before the Great Recession, which is a significant impact to the freight market as it stands today. So again, we see in June that it kind of fell off from May levels. Now, I know that there's been a lot of talk about the freight market has already peaked and we've seen it cycle through or whatever, but you can still see that the index is way above any point in time in 2017, even as it's cooling off. That's okay. And I believe we've talked about in the past, July tends to come back down in terms of freight volume. Now that was June, of course, but a lot of these invoices don't hit. They kind of pump through the system, and the freight markets kind of destabilize, and spot market activity increases, and it has this ripple effect. So volume comes through, freight markets scramble to go cover their loads, or the carriers are scrambling to go cover these shipper loads. It creates this lag of capacity that takes time to kind of recover. So that being said, we're going to look at another index. Again, the Broughton DAT Freight Barometer, which is a really good index to kind of get the other half of that picture. So we showed you shipping volume, and now I'm going to show you the Donald Broughton's Freight Barometer. And what it is, it kind of merges, it's built off, it gives you that idea of capacity and carrier attitude as well. So basically what this does is kind of merge like spot rate and load availability, and gives you a good clean index to look at to see just what the market is reacting, how the market is reacting to this volume, what it's doing in general. Historically, we are at really high levels, as you can see here. Again, June spot market activity was one of the biggest months in a long time. Now, of course, we've had a lot of spot market activity over the last year, 12 months or so after I think we saw the produce season really kick things off last year, and it destabilized the entire freight market. Spot markets went up, and then subsequently contract rates. So in the second quarter this year, we saw the spot market go back to a more destabilized scenario. We saw that at the beginning of 2018, which is very uncharacteristic. What happened here was not as much product of volume as it was of carrier sentiment. And what I mean by that is carriers were operating off of year-long contracts. They had not adapted to the new ELD capacity constraints. So early part of the year, typically when volumes crash, it doesn't mean that they were super elevated. It just means that carriers were basically rejecting more loads. So they could get a higher rate in the spot market versus the contract rates that were built off of 2016 freight market data. And going back to 2016, you can see there was somewhat of a mini recession in freight markets in 2016. Not that we had a recession in the economy itself, but GDP did decline, or it did soften for a good period of time in 2016. And we have a slew of economic indicators that can back this up and tell you about that. But I'm not going to go into too many of those today. If you're interested in some of those economic indicators, again, I'm going to reference the website. And the webinar last week, I believe we covered most of those.
I think so.
Last week. Again, check those out if you want me to dive more deeply into economic indicators. But this week, I think we're going to keep it a little higher level.
Yeah, and just really quickly, so this is really great information, and I think especially the CAS index shows the cyclical moves or the ebbs and flow of the freight market in terms of that shipment index. So how can I take that, being that that's kind of a look in the past, and we're working on freight invoicing, so by the time all of that's reported, it's already happened. So how can I take this information, whether it's DAT Freight, Donald's barometer here, or whether it's CAS index, how can I take that information and use it to make real-time decisions, whether I'm a shipper, broker, 3PL, carrier? So what can I do with this data to make decisions, right now and moving forward in the next, weeks and months?
I am so glad you asked that question, Brad. So what I'm going to pull up now, what I've done is kind of set you up with a high level economic indicator. So to get a full picture, like I said, you need to have high level economic understanding. And as that pertains to freight markets in general, you need to understand the connection, because there's no way that you're going to be able to predict the future without understanding what's happening in the past. So as you saw in the CAS index, and Brad mentioned, there's a very cyclical nature to freight markets. And that's why it's important to understand just basic freight market movements. In January, volumes tend to slack off. This past year has been one of the craziest years in freight markets that has existed for a long time. Like, we typically see freight markets really follow the same pattern every year, as it falls off in January and it slowly starts to ramp back up in February, then kicks off in March, going into the late spring, peaking sometime in June, and then maybe having another hill in August, September, before kind of gradually falling off into the holidays. You need to have a full understanding of what's going on in the freight markets in general. And one of those things is the overall economy. So if you don't know what's happening in the economy itself, you're really not getting a full picture of how the freight market is going to work too, because that's what moves trucks, is commodity flows, supply and demand for individual things like housing, retail sales. All these kind of things give you a general, I guess, the white paper in the background for you to paint your full granular picture. And that's what I'm going to do for you right here with the outbound tender rejection index. Now, this is a lot more near-time, day-to-day operational number. For those of you that have tuned in, I think you're familiar with it, but I'm going to go ahead and again define what tender rejections are. So when a shipper sends over a load order electronically, the carrier has the option on their end to accept or reject that load, and they'll reject it for one of two reasons. One of those reasons is they simply don't have the truck to cover the load. The next reason is that they're not accepting the load because they have a better option somewhere else. Typically that means a higher rate. They don't do things just because they tend to feel like them. They're going to get paid to do this, and that translates into the spot market. Both of these numbers, both of these reasons translate into the spot market regardless of the reason. And what that means is so they're not fulfilling their contracts. There's only one reason to reject your contract rate and potentially upset your customer by not covering their loads, and that is because you're going to get paid significantly more to do that, because it's not going to be something that a carrier just does for another 2 or 3 cents a mile. It's going to be something that they do for several more cents per mile, just so they don't disrupt that relationship they have with the shipper. So tender rejections are actually a very good indicator of what's about to happen in the spot market, because they're going to reject these loads prior to you seeing these show up in rates. I mean, they're going to show up.
And also, I think it's not just an indication of the spot market, but also an indication of the volume as well, right?
Yes.
As you see volumes decrease, or in looking at just this chart, as we see the end of June, beginning of July, we see a very similar thing that's happened on a cyclical basis with the CAS Freight Index, and that is a decrease in shipments during this month of July, whereas you see an outbound tender rejection index percentage-wise decreasing 6 to 7 percentage points. Looks like a big reason for that is the lack of volume compared to the last several months, thus having
Exactly.
carriers accepting more contracted freight because the spot market's not, so again, tied to the spot market, but also volume is, I think, a big part of that, right?
Exactly. No, volume and carrier sentiment is actually what this is a good measure of. It's an operational movement. It's not a financial indicator. What I mean by that, it's not something that somebody in the accounting is going to see or use to
Right.
measure this. So the difference between financial and operational metrics: operational are more day-to-day, near-time oriented. Financial metrics tend to have a lag in them, and also they're kind of subject to other pieces influencing them. Trying to think of a good, for instance, in your income statement, you're looking at things like depreciation that don't have a real impact to your overall day-to-day business, but it's a part of your accounting, and it makes your numbers potentially look better or worse depending on your situation. But I digress. So a lot of people kind of ask, how do I translate the tender rejection index into something that I can use on a daily basis? So, and some people also ask, like, what does it mean that it's a 20% tender rejection index? Well, it's not so much what the absolute value of the number is. It is more about what the number's doing. So over time, you see these movements right here, and it happens in a matter of days. So that's why you see this choppiness to it, is because it's happening in real time, like near time, very fast. So you're going to get a good indication of what's happening relatively quickly. Right now, we're sitting at about 20.15% rejection. I don't think I finished my definition of tender rejection earlier when I said, so if a carrier gets 2 load requests from a shipper and they reject one of those, you have a 50% tender rejection index. So they're rejecting about 1/5 of the loads that they're getting over in the country at this point. So it's hit, it looks like a yearly high at the end of June, and then before really kind of falling off here in the last couple of weeks. And I'm going to continuously point back to the broader economy in some of these, just so we have a point of reference. A lot of, I know that tender rejection indexes are new to a lot of people, so I really want to paint a good picture of what they mean and how relevant they are. And I think a lot of people can relate to that in terms of the broader economy movement. So on the CAS index that I showed you, you see it with shipper volume. Every July, freight tends to kind of retract a little bit. So we see this softer market, and it's because at the end of June, we have this heated shipper activity. People are cramming their volumes out before the holiday because people are going on vacation. You also have end of Q2. They're trying to make sure their numbers, they capture as much revenue as possible. So when they go report to the boards or have their calls, they can capture all that revenue. When people are sending these out en masse, it disrupts the entire market. Capacity tightens up, and then it's not a sustainable thing. So it tends to retract. And we see that right here. Now, at what point does July kind of start to pick back up? Sometimes July does not necessarily pick back up. It can wait until like August. Back to school has an impact, as well as hurricane season. Now, hurricane season is forecasted to be a little bit less this year, and these kind of market disrupting events haven't really happened with the ferocity that they had last year. But again, last July was also soft, and things did not pick back up until late July, early August, and that was before a hurricane hit. So it's not too disconcerting, or it's certainly way too early to say that the freight markets have come back down. I don't think that's happened just yet. You can see back here in May, that was where our annual low was. And again, we've had an unusual year with tender rejections being elevated up until April 1st, which is about the average time for contract implementation. So what they did was they got their contracts implemented at a higher rate. So they finally went through cycle. The spot market fell off because essentially they started implementing these higher rates. So it didn't make sense for the carriers to turn it down anymore and play in the spot market. That fell into May before spiking back up into June, and now they're falling back off again. So in a declining market, it doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't have its opportunities.
Right.
So I'm going to go through and pick out a couple of specific areas, and I'm going to show you how I found them. So just because the country itself is falling off, and I'm kind of walking you through my process of it's a little bit more spread out. And this is the part where I would say, this is where, if you're in the day-to-day operation, this is where you kind of start. After you've understood the economics of your situation, you may not even care what it's going to do in the next month or two. This is your day-to-day process using SONAR. And where I would start in most situations, shipper, carrier, or broker, before I go through my process of booking loads or accepting loads or whatever it is I'm doing, I'm checking this map right here. And we have something called the Outbound Tender Rejection Index weekly change. We also have a biweekly change and a monthly change. And this is very useful on the map. It's also available in chart form, but I find it to be a lot more useful on the map because it gives me a quick visual aid to see exactly where my movements and tender rejections are happening. And like I pointed out earlier, the movement and tender rejection index is what's important, not necessarily the absolute number. The absolute number is more important in an over time type analysis. But when you're looking at a day-to-day movement, you really want to look, oh, sorry about that. You really want to look to see where my best opportunities for freight are happening right now. So the weekly change is going to show a darker colored blue for the areas that have seen the biggest increase in tender rejections in the last week, in the last 7 days. Looking at this tells me that the Lubbock market right here is really having a big increase in outbound tender rejections over the last 7 days. See right here, you can scroll through and see that it's 33.56%, which doesn't mean a lot to me right now. But then I'm going to go over to one of my, you can click on a chart or a screen up here, most of you, but I have my own pages that I like to go through. And again, I reference the website to learn how to use some of these to make your own page and stuff like that. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to look for Lubbock, Texas, and see if I can't find the OTRI Lubbock. So I see it down there is OTRI.LBB. I know a lot of people don't know what the Lubbock airport code is, but just type in the word Lubbock and you'll have a list of all the different indices that are available for the Lubbock market. So I see right here, wow, they went from 15% tender rejection rate to 33%. I don't think it takes too much to understand that is a significant movement. When you have a 17, 18 basis point move, it's worth noting. So that means if I am a shipper in the Lubbock area, I need to watch out for spot market volatility. If I'm getting rejected a lot, that means that I need to go and maybe check my routing guide and make sure that I have, if I need to get a load out sooner, maybe I'm going to sit on it just so I can avoid getting messed with in the spot market. If I'm a carrier, I'm seeing if I have any way that I can potentially, I'm going to go through my customers. I'm going to go and see if I can position freight. If I have an opportunity going into Lubbock, which typically people do not want to go into.
Yeah.
There's a.
Well, I was going to say too, to your point, if you're a carrier, that's a really good point, and a leading factor that I wanted to bring up to some of these markets, as you see some of these X markets increase with, very volatile, maybe over a day or a week, a high percentage increase. What's the behavior that we're mapping, right? So if you're a shipper, then you're having trouble covering your freight, so that freight's going to the spot market, right? If you're a carrier and you're seeing this increase in the spot market and these high prices, you're trying to send trucks to that area. So you're leaving also a gap, or you're affecting the capacity of nearby surrounding regions. So one thing I would say as well that I want to add is that as you see these increases in some of these X market regions, it can be a leading factor as well to the surrounding X markets and the percentages that you may see increase following the week or the coming days or the following week, as some of that capacity is chasing some of these higher rates in these
No,
these areas.
that's absolutely the case. What tends to happen is one of these major markets tends to have an event or something that sucks capacity into it. And just like, something moving from high to low pressure, all the capacity moves that direction to try to capture it eventually. Now, what SONAR does is it gives you this heads up. It's like, hey guys, there's this opportunity sitting out here in Lubbock. You may not be able to capture it today, but then you look through the rest of the country on your weekly change map, and you can pick out areas that you may have opportunities in that you're not going to be able to tell. Like once these things once you kind of figure out where these capacity constraints have happened, you tend to have already missed the opportunity.
Yeah.
I mean, you can see here that this thing happens fast. So within a matter of a few days, this area has seen several tender rejections. And I'm going to compare it quickly to the United States. Sometimes this helps give you kind of an idea of how markets relate to the general freight pattern. A lot of times a backhaul lane or traditional lane that you don't want to move your truck into because it's not going to have much freight going out of it will have a lower rejection rate, such as the case in Seattle.
Mm-hmm.
Lubbock, for instance, once you get your truck into Lubbock, typically you're grabbing everything that you can to get out. That's not always the case. Lubbock's kind of this tweener market where it's highly volatile. The volumes are not necessarily high. We're going to speak to the volume situation a little bit later. But so it's going to be a little bit more volatile, but all I'm saying is that it basically gives you this window into these granular markets that you can take advantage of that you might not be thinking about. I believe I'm going to go back here to the map again to kind of pick out another market that we've seen kind of spike up here lately. Little Rock this week showed up with a significant tender rejection rate increase. As I type in my OTRI LIT. So Little Rock spiked significantly, and I can see that it is actually at one of the more elevated levels that it's been. Arkansas is, of course, a big hub for freight carriers around in the country. JB Hunt and FedEx, of course, in Memphis. So I see here that we've had this huge spike in this volatile market. Again, I'm going to go out there, and Little Rock itself is not necessarily a backhaul lane, but again, I'm going to use this to kind of start my process of figuring out what's going on in Little Rock, what's happening there that's creating this need for capacity that just isn't getting covered right now. And one of the tools that the next step of this is what other things can I figure out from SONAR that's going to lead me down the path. So one of the things that we have in here is the tender rejection index based on equipment type or trailer type, I should say. So we have OTRI or RTRI. And when I pull the RTRI up, which is the Reefer Trailer Tender Rejection Index for Little Rock, I can see that they've had significant increase in reefer tender rejection indexes. Again, the volumes are probably not extremely high here, but you can tell that's one part of the equation. They need reefers in Little Rock right now. And I'm going to go ahead and pull up the VTRI, which is the dry van. Kind of give the full picture. So we have it for two trailer types for the market granularities, but in the country we also have a flatbed FTRI indicator, but it's only available in the country because, as we know, flatbed tends to operate largely in the spot market and not necessarily in the contract arena. So if you're trying to figure out what's going on in a market, a good way to kind of dig deeper into what's happening. Maybe you don't have reefer trailers, or that's not something that you specialize in. So you can go in here and kind of see, well, reefers, they're pretty high, and they did jump up, but the V-Tri shot up significantly. So you've got some dry van opportunities in the Little Rock market right now, as that volatility is insane.
Cool. And we do have a couple questions that we're we'll answer one right now. We're going to save most of them for the end, but in terms of what time is the daily TRI, the tender reject index, updated?
So it goes in at midnight, our time. So for the previous day. So you get up early in the morning to check your OTRI, and you'll have it there for the previous day. Obviously, we don't have intraday tender rejection indexes available right now, but yeah, it updates every night, overnight, in the morning Eastern time. Should clarify that. Hopefully that helps. Okay, so I want to kind of recap too, to kind of, again, give some of our newer users a full kind of idea of some of the stuff that's available in SONAR, but also kind of close a loop that we opened last week. So I think I pointed out the Freightos Baltic Index showing container rates going through the roof last week, or actually in the past 2 weeks. Right as the Trump tariffs were kicked off July 3rd, shippers scrambled to push freight out into the ports to make sure that they didn't get hit with more tariffs. Also, a little bit of carrier influence there, as some of these carriers limited their capacity, played the market a little bit. And you see that a lot of them, I believe 20% of the capacity from China to the North American West Coast is coming offline in August in front of the concerns over the trade. So container volumes are obviously a big factor in freight market movements. One of the things we've watched in the past is how container flows come into the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach, and then basically suck up all the capacity in the country. That's how big of an impact container flows can have. And in the last week, we saw a ton of port cities have these bumps and tender rejections as the rest of the country was falling down. And what I have pulled up here is the Freightos Baltic Index. And what this does is measures the average spot market price for 40-foot containers in specific lanes. I have China to North American East Coast. That's what that CNAE means. And China to North American West Coast. You see they're correlated pretty heavily as volumes are going to both sides of the country at this point. These tend to lead any kind of freight market activity, because it takes a good week to a week and a half to 2 weeks, depending on the side of the country you're on, for these containers to hit. So when these rates hit and they get higher, the ports need to watch out. The freight market tends to follow it, as it did in May, where we watched the LA market kind of blow up in response to the produce season in combination with the containers coming in from China as they came back online after the Chinese New Year. So I'm going to talk a little bit about LA, as we've seen this bump in LA kind of fall off. People have gone into the LA market and probably taken care of that. LA is a good area to go for trucks in general, maybe not operate in specifically, but to go to get freight. LA is typically one of those lanes. It almost operates, I can't say that it's a bellwether, but it can signal events in the market. What I mean by that is last year's 2017 produce season was very slow to start, and the delay created this unforeseen capacity crunch in the West Coast. So as people kind of flooded to go get there and cover the produce season, it sucked up, it impacted everything from reefers to dry vans, because a lot of produce can move in some dry van. But reefer trailers are also used for other things when they're not hauling temperature controlled freight. So right now we're seeing this market kind of come back to stability. Again, in some of these other areas like New Orleans, we saw the similar bump. it's starting to come back down. So something to note of that is potentially we're seeing container volumes increase, and the market is kind of cooling off after a quick little hit. And these are important events too to note, because they're not something that you would normally see just operating as a general carrier or a shipper or any kind of operator.
I think these two are a good example as well of the volume difference going through in a market like LA, for example. You could probably say a market like Dallas, Chicago, Atlanta, these heavier metropolitan areas that experience higher volumes are going to have their tender rejection percentages are going to react not quite as volatile, and they're probably going to typically maintain a lower number. Is that fair to say, or can you kind of speak towards that when you compare New Orleans, which we see a similar increase to LA, but of course we're looking at up near a 45 to.
And that's a good
40%.
question. The thing to take away from this, since I've shown you LA and New Orleans, LA obviously is a tremendous volume in it. It's going to be a little bit less volatile than your New Orleans market, which does not have the exposure to freight moving through it as much as the LA market would have. But as you can see, you walk through and say, well, why is LA moving? Wait a minute. And you can see, like, what does LA have in it that's unique? They have produce, all sorts of stuff coming in there. You can look up and down the I-5 for what's going on there. But it's, number one, is the largest container port area in the country. The number one port, obviously China has a lot to do with that. So watching that city is actually a good indicator of what's going on in the international trade and what might happen moving forward. Because we saw in May, it hit the port, it hit LA first, and then spread throughout the country as capacity dried up in Texas and in Atlanta and eventually everywhere else. So it kind of, again, I'm not saying that it leads the market, but certain things can trickle from LA and come into the country. I'm going to show you one more thing, and then I'm going to stop talking for a little bit as we
answer some questions
and give you guys an idea of what we have upcoming. And so the last thing I'm going to show you this week is Chicago. So I think the biggest markets in the country are LA, Dallas, Atlanta, Chicago. Obviously, there's other markets like New York and Philly that have a lot more regional impact. Seattle obviously is very touchy with a backhaul lane. But these markets right here kind of are a good way to look at the rest of the country in terms of tender rejection indexes, because they will suck capacity out of the marketplace faster than anywhere else. Chicago is moving contrary to the rest of the country's tender rejection indexes. A big sign that there's something potentially happening in Chicago for you carriers and brokers and shippers in this area. It's definitely something to take note of, as everywhere else in the marketplace appears to be settling down. Chicago's kind of heating up. Just wanted to give that quick heads up that I do look at LA, Atlanta, Dallas, and Chicago on a daily basis for any kind of potential market movement outside of what I was showing you on the weekly change map. That's my last tidbit for the week. And then I'm going to turn it over to Brad, who's going to give you a quick overview of what we have upcoming, and also
we'll pause here for 30 seconds and give a little bit of time for people to ask questions. We'll start to answer some of those and then kind of finish things out here. So,
all right. So we got a good question about how much volume does a tender rejection represent daily? We can't really speak to the specific number, but we are coming out here in the next week or so with a tender volume kind of index. And what that's going to do, it's going to give you a way to see exactly, like, kind of measure what kind of volume impact a tender rejection index is experiencing because of volume. So for instance, if you had, and it's going to be an index, so it's going to be based on a specific time period. And so how indexes work, or you give a base number and a base period. And for this one, it's going to be a base day of the year, and everything, and the base number is going to be 100. So say I had 10 loads in the base period. The next period, which is going to be a day. So the next day I see 11 loads come through on an accepted basis. What that's going to show up as is a 110 on the tender volume index. So 10% more happened on that day.
And that's going to help you justify, or it's going to help you be able to tell if some of these large or volatile increases in a market, for example, like LA or like New Orleans, how significant that percent changes based on, have they received an influx in volume in that area? Have they decreased in volume? So I think that'll really help some of our users understand. And then kind of the blanket to that number is these electronic transactions. So from tender rejection indices and tender lead time, a lot of these time series, the weekly movements are all derived from the similar sources that are covering in scope between 80 to 85% of all electronic transactions in the in the United States for full truckload between van, reefer, and some flatbed in there. So hopefully that answers your question. Do we have any more that we need to answer right now? If any come across here, we will grab them and answer them. So for the last few minutes, we're just going to go over what we have coming up. As I mentioned, we've added 60 new data sets just in the month of July alone. A lot of them have been from customer feedback, different things that they would like to see. And what I'm about to go through, I think you will continue to see a similar theme of what we're adding. We have coming out container volume related to individual ports and commodities. As Zach touched on, we also will have the volume index by geographical region, by these X market regions. So you'll be able to see inbound and outbound. We do have coming out in August as well, which has been something that we've been asked to add by several different customers, origin destination pairs by tender rejection percentage. So you will be able to take these various, as we're looking at here, the Chicago X market, you'll be able to search outbound tender reject index, Chicago to Atlanta, for example, or Atlanta to Chicago. So that will be, I'm sure, something that a lot of you will find very useful. And then furthermore, we'll soon be adding some DAT sponsored pricing for van lanes that we will be inputting across major U.S. shipping lanes. Stay tuned for more information on that. That will be coming in August as well.
22% of
yes.
freight, and also that represents 80% of the country potentially.
Correct. Yeah.
80%.
So the lanes, the major shipping lanes, LA to Seattle, LA to Dallas, back and forth there, and then the triangle of Chicago, Atlanta, Philly represent 22% of the nation's shipping volume, and the effect that those markets have affects over 80% of the market. Is that the right way to say it?
Yeah, they impact 80% of the freight market in the country.
Perfect. So that'll be alongside, and those will actually that'll be pricing information for dry van only. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, as I mentioned, we'll have the origin destination pairs for the tender rejection percentages that will be available. And then we're also going to be adding cross-border data. So we'll have some different Canadian and Mexico volume information. Give you an idea. I know that'll be helpful for a lot of these cross-border regions.
It's very relevant to what we're seeing now, especially with all the concerns over trade and things like that. You're going to see some erratic shipper behavior, which of course creates volatility in the freight market.
Sure. And then we are coming to an end here of our time for the webinar, and also coming to an end of our free trial participant time here at the end of July. As you see, a lot of these updates that these value adds we've put into the platform over the past month, and that we will, as you can see, continue to over not just the next month, but the continued existence of SONAR as we continue to drive the value and help you make decisions on a real-time basis when operating in the freight markets. So we do still have some time here, the last 5 or 6 days. If you have not had a demo and participated in the free trial, there is still time to do so. You can reach us at sales@freightwaves.com, or you can also reach us via our little contact us email here, and you can still take advantage of the discounted pricing that is being offered to our free trial member participants that will last, like I said, until the end of the month. So if you have any questions, you can reach us there. Otherwise, you can also find us at the website, freightwaves.com/sonar. That is all we have for you, I think, today. Thank you for joining myself and Zach Strickland for your weekly SONAR webinar. And I think we are going to sign off. We'll see you guys next week.
Cool. All right, guys. Appreciate it. Have a good week.
Have a good one.